This keeps getting crazier. Just when we thought the Brandon Aiyuk situation couldn't drag out any longer, a scenario arises in how the 49ers could keep the disgruntled wide receiver. What's up, everybody, and welcome in. I'm Carl McManus. This is Commanders Digest, so let's get to talking all things Washington Commanders. On tap for today's episode, we'll talk why the San Francisco 49ers haven't cut Brandon Aiyuk yet, how they could actually end up keeping him, and a Diggs that's interested in DC. For which Diggs we're talking about, you'll just have to stick around to the end of the episode. But first things first, the lingering question surrounding Brandon Aiyuk and the 49ers. And Dan Graziano has the same question that we all do. Why hasn't San Francisco cut him just yet? According to him, everyone in the league knows they're going to eventually have to release him. The 49ers might have voided Aiyuk's contract guarantees last year, but they didn't void the contract entirely. If he's on the team in 2026, they have to pay him $27 million. And if a team trades for him, it would have to pay him $27 million. More on that in just a second. But if the 49ers cut him, they don't have to pay him that money, and the team that signs him could theoretically get him for less. So before we break this down even further and the factual inaccuracies that Dan Graziano is telling you all, first let me pause and give some love to the sponsor of this video, Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 sports picks app, and it is the best way to get on the action. In fact, I'll show you some of the picks I'm making later on in this video, but for now, download Prize Picks using the link in the description, and don't forget to use our code DIGEST because it really helps me and this channel out, but it also helps you out because you get $50 instantly in your lineups when you play your first $5. Thank you again to Prize Picks for sponsoring this video, but we're talking about Brandon Aiyuk and the money that's no longer guaranteed to him. So Dan Graziano, in his lingering question, says that the 49ers have to pay him $27 million if he's on the roster this year. That's not necessarily factually correct. His guarantees were $27 million, but again, the 49ers voided that, so they no longer are guaranteed to pay him $27 million. When we actually look at Brandon Aiyuk's contract, he only has a base salary in 2026 of $1.15 million. He has a $2.79 million signing bonus. He has an option bonus, workout bonus, a roster bonus, and game bonuses as well. But it's not necessarily the $27 million that Dan Graziano is saying. But what I really included Graziano's mention for is that, yes, the 49ers should end up releasing Brandon Aiyuk, but I also understand why they haven't. So when it comes to a team that has to pay him this much money, yes, and out after 2027, but you see the dead cap number there and then the dead cap number this year as well. He is still due a lot of money. It makes sense to me why they're trying to get a team to at least incentivize them to move on from him. Yes, the Washington Commanders want him, and everybody but Adam Peters has made that clear. Of course, Adam Peters can't necessarily say anything. He mentioned it prior to the draft combine that if he says anything about wanting Brandon Aiyuk, that's technically tampering because he's still under contract with the 49ers. He did mention that he loves him as a person and that he thinks everybody deserves a second chance. But in terms of playing with the Commanders, Adam Peters can't necessarily comment on that. Now, Jayden Daniels can comment on that, and he has. He's mentioned wanting to play with a former wide receiver that he played with in college that now plays on the West Coast. And then Brandon Aiyuk also mentioned that he wants to play with Jayden Daniels. The two spend a lot of time together. We saw it in 2024 before getting that massive contract extension with the 49ers. All the flirting, for lack of a better word, that was out there. Brandon Aiyuk taking pictures of the Commanders playbook, playing with the Commanders in Madden, all that stuff. Brandon Aiyuk wants to be here. Jayden Daniels wants Brandon Aiyuk. It's just a matter of when this actually ends up happening. And again, I don't blame the 49ers for not just flat out cutting him. For a team that has to pay him this much money, and then when you look at how they could actually get an out on the contract by releasing or trading him, there's still a lot of money. So whether it's a trade, whether it's a release, whether it's pre-June 1st or post-June 1st, it is still a lot of money for the 49ers. There's a dead cap hit, whether they trade or release him pre-June 1st, of $33.5 million. And then you have negative cap savings, so still money that they don't even get back for cutting or releasing him prior to June 1st. Now, there is a little bit of savings after June 1st. You see a 2026 dead cap of $12.3 million, whether they trade or release him, and then a dead cap in 2027 of $21 million. So still ends up being $33 million overall, just spread over 2 years, but they do get cap savings in 2016 at $1.3 million. And for a guy that signed a massive deal, has already gotten $48 million from the 49ers in this contract so far, only playing 7 games before tearing his ACL. I don't blame them for not wanting to give him any more, especially having a dead cap of $33 million. But again, nobody else is going out there and trading for him. We've seen it that nobody's done it. The Commanders aren't doing it. Nobody else has done it. Nobody's trading for Brandon Aiyuk because not only is there the possibility that he's a lunatic now, driving 100 miles per hour past the stadium, but also the fact that he hasn't played football in over a calendar year. It'll be a year and a half, 2 years by the time he actually hits the field once again for any team, let alone the San Francisco 49ers. Whether it's the burgundy and gold, whether it's somebody else, he hasn't played in over a year, 2 years by the time he probably actually ends up being on the field once again. So I don't blame the 49ers for wanting to get something out of him, but also no team is going out there trading for him, especially not Adam Peters. We've already seen it in 2 instances where he's had the possibility. 2024 didn't trade for him. 2025, of course, after tearing his ACL, he wasn't doing it. But he got a different 49ers wide receiver instead in Deebo Samuel. But with all that, it still hasn't happened. And San Francisco is actually finding a way that they can keep him even longer. According to Savannah Tajagiu, I'm butchering that name, forgive me, but she's with 49ers Roundtable, giving a possibility of how San Francisco could actually end up keeping him and how they hold the leverage in the situation, whether it's with Washington. That's not necessarily not necessarily factual, but they do hold some leverage when it comes to to Brandon Aiyuk, So she says the 49ers hold the leverage with a reserve did not report list, which allows them to continue finding Aiyuk up to $50,000 per day without a salary accounting against their 90-man roster. So for San Francisco, he's a distraction they can afford to keep. As we already mentioned, they voided the contract guarantees for 2026. They can continue doing the same thing if he does not report, which is how they got away with voiding the contract in the first place. And then they also can continue finding him. So Brandon Aiyuk is the only one losing in this situation. Washington doesn't necessarily need to go out there and get him. I know there's an ESPN article, which we'll break down a little bit later on this channel, saying that Washington's main or biggest hole still on the roster is wide receiver. I disagree with them in that. I think they've done a lot at the wide receiver position, but that's neither here nor there at this point. Getting along with what Savannah says, for Washington, the clock is ticking. Peters must decide if Aiyuk is worth the contract, worth the draft capital, and the massive contract extension, or if it's time to pivot towards other targets to support Jayden Daniels' development. So before we get to talking about the other targets, which we will in a little bit, the massive contract, that's not necessarily happening. If Brandon Aiyuk ends up signing here, it's going to be a prove-it deal. It'll be a 1-year deal, heavily incentive-based, based on the amount of snaps that Brandon Aiyuk plays, his stats, and then whether he's able to stay out of trouble, all the like. So it's not going to be a massive contract extension. It's going to be more based on incentives, and it's going to be a proven deal for most likely 1 year. But Savannah does bring up a good point towards the end, saying maybe it's time to pivot towards other targets for Washington and Jayden Daniels. And one of those other targets could be a guy that we've mentioned on the channel who was in DC this past weekend for his charity Diggs Deep, shedding some light on the interest in DC, saying, I'm familiar with the city, familiar with the people. We're going to see down the pipe over these next couple months what looks good and what makes sense. I definitely want to shed some light on them. Might go check them out for a little bit. It's love, it's hometown, so it makes sense. It makes sense to Stefon Diggs. It makes sense to me, although the older wide receiver at 32, they both suffered ACL injuries, him and Brandon Aiyuk, in 2024. Although Stefon Diggs has come back, Aiyuk hasn't played in over a year. Yes, the younger wide receiver at 28 to Stefon Diggs is 32, but Diggs showing in 2025 with the New England Patriots, who made it to the Super Bowl, that he is still a very productive wide receiver. In fact, New England's best wide receiver. So let me know down in the comments if you think Stefon Diggs still makes sense for Washington. But we've reached the end of this video, so it's time for my prize picks. Taking a look at PSG versus Lens, taking a look at the Ligue 1 Player of the Year, Ousmane Dembele. I have him going for less than 3 shots against Lens, although they're only 6 points ahead of them on the table. I think Ousmane Dembele doesn't play the whole match, so I have him going for less than 3 shots against them. And then I have Vitinha going for less than 100.5 passes attempted. You see over his last 5, not getting anywhere close to that. Again, I don't see all of PSG's regular starters going the full match against Lens, even though they still have something to play for with the Ligue 1 title. They're probably still mostly focused on the Champions League final, which is May 30th. So even though there is some time, I don't see all their main players playing the full match. But as always, use your sports knowledge and use Prize Picks using the link in the description to download Prize Picks and use our code DIGEST because it helps me and this channel out, but it helps you too with $50 instantly in your lineups when you play your first $5. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and thank you to Prize Picks for sponsoring this video. Again, let me know what you think on Stefon Diggs and the possibility to come into DC down in the comments. But for now, that's all. Thank you everybody for tuning in. See you next time.